Hello friends, so today's video is going to be a look at the Goodreads Choice Award nominees, specifically for the fantasy section. I am going to touch on a little bit some of the other categories towards the end of the video, but I wanted to start by letting you know what books are up to vote on for the fantasy category, and then from there I wanted to compare my Goodreads Choice Award predictions that I made a while back to what ended up actually being on the list. Then have a little bit of a discussion about some that I am surprised weren't there, and just in general, a little bit of a chat about the nominees. And then after that, we'll get into a couple of the other categories and some books that I'm hoping to pick up as a result of them being on these lists. I'll have timestamps if you would like to jump ahead. I'm just going to get right into what the nominees are. We have Electra, House of Sky and Breath, The Atlas Six, Fairy Tale, Nettle and Bone, Legends and Lattes, Thistlefoot, The Book Eaters, KKE, The War of Two Queens, Babel, Daughter of the Moon Goddess, Ordinary Monsters, The Golden Enclaves, The World We Make, The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, The Lost Metal, The Stardust Thief, A River Enchanted, and When Women Were Dragons. Some of these I'm not surprised at all ended up on the list. The Lost Metal, House of Sky and Breath, I think most people expected those. There's a few on here that I was surprised showed up. And if you want to hear about any of these books, a little bit more of what they're about, my thoughts on them for the ones that I've read, which is a fair amount of them, I'll have in the description bar the books that I've read and then the coordinating new releases wrap up I've done where I talk about those books in case you'd like to hear about them. But regardless, I was kind of a little disappointed. That's the case every year, right? There's certain books that you expect to be on there, certain books you hope are going to be on there. They don't show up. And in their place are some books that you're like, ugh, who cares? But obviously everybody has different opinions and different things that they like. In fantasy, what's great is it's not just this one little narrow niche thing. Fantasy can be so many different things. And so I'm glad at least we see some variety, but I have some opinions that I'll get into in the discussion portion of this video. I wanted to, just for fun, compare my predictions to what ended up being on there, because this is where the one that is kind of, I think, a snub is present. So The Lost Metal, Crescent City, Babel, all of those, I think pretty much everybody knew was going to show up on the list. I wasn't surprised at all. But then beyond that, I had KKE and Electra, and I noted that Goodreads Choice Award nominees tends to like the mythology retellings, especially Greek retellings. They really lean into those, but I was pretty sure KKE was going to be on there, and it was. I also predicted Daughter of the Moon Goddess would be on there because this is one that I find it is, of course, appealing to people who generally like fantasy, but I also think it has that mass appeal where people who maybe don't typically read fantasy might gravitate towards this book, which then I think helps it reach a broader audience. And so I wasn't surprised to see that one either. I also guessed that The Stardust Thief would be there. The Stardust Thief has the advantage of being one that I think a lot of people were excited about, and then on top of that, it was included in a Book of the Month. So that's true of KKE as well. Both of those were Book of the Month books. And then I thought the Atlas Paradox would be on the list because it did come out before the cutoff date, but actually the Atlas Six was because it was re-released as a traditionally published book, because originally the Atlas Six was self-published. And that's an interesting thing that I'm seeing. That's true, I think, of Legends of Lattes. That would be a fun book. Legends and Lattes. I think that's true of that one as well, where it started self-published and then was traditionally published, and that's why we're seeing it as an option. Anywho, the one that didn't make the list that I was kind of like, about is Hunger of the Gods. I was excited because I thought for sure this one would show up, given that Shadow of the Gods last year was there. This one came out and has been received quite well. It felt very similar to the first one in its tone, in the way that the characters are shown. I mean, it's more of what you would expect from that series. It's more of that kind of Norse feel, inspired by the Nordic gods. And it was solid. It was a good release. I'm super surprised it's not on the list. And I'll add, this is kind of where I'm segueing into the discussion portion of the video. With these particular nominees and also the absence of Hunger of the Gods, it very much feels as if the more epic type of fantasy stories, they don't seem to be given credit, at least this year. There are other years where they dominate and then other things aren't getting credit. And there's always going to be certain things that don't show up. There's always going to be the ones that you're like, how can this not be there? But given that Shadow of the Gods was there last year, and they clearly have no issue putting sequels, because you see the Crescent City one, you see the Mistborn Era 2 sequel, you see the Enclaves one, but these really, really epic type of fantasy stories that feel really grand, they don't seem to be present. Not even they don't seem to be, they're not present on this list. And that's okay. I don't mind if things change, if trends, because at the end of the day, the Goodreads nominees tend to be popularity contests and they're a reflection of trends. I am aware and I acknowledge that trends shift, and that's not an issue to me, except for it feels like Goodreads has its set of trends that it tends to lean into, specifically the mythology retellings. There's a reason that I knew KKE and Electra were going to be on there, and some of these other ones as well. I think Thistlefoot's not mythology, but I think it's like a Baba Yaga retelling. They really like their fairy tale mythology retellings, which is fine. I think also a lot of retellings these days are leaning into who are the forgotten people within these stories, who are the people that represent the pieces of the story that, if we look at it now with a modern lens, would change how we see that story. They definitely seem to like those kinds of retellings, and I like those kinds of retellings too, but I also like epic fantasy, and I wish we had a little bit more variety in the kinds of fantasy books we're seeing on these Goodreads nominees. I also am very curious your thoughts in regards to something like Legends and Lattes and the Atlas 6, where they were previously self-published, now are traditionally published, so then they get to be on, at least they have the opportunity to be on the Goodreads nominees. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that that's a little unfair? Do you think it's perfectly fine? I kind of think, I suppose I have somewhat negative feelings towards this, and that I think it almost tells people, oh, well, we can take this seriously now that there's a traditional publisher backing it. So there's that. It feels like these books wouldn't have had a chance to be on the nominees lists had they not had the publisher. It just makes it seem like we don't really respect or grant any legitimacy to self-published books. But then beyond that, a lot of times the reasons books get picked up by traditional publishers is because they reach a certain level of popularity. I think that's really true of the Atlas 6. It exploded on TikTok, and then people were picking it up here on BookTube, and people obviously were picking it up all over the place. It has a lot of fans, and it almost seems like it's kind of an unfair advantage to have built this huge fan base, then get picked up, and then now the next year you can qualify. I still don't think it's going to win. I would guess that Sarah J. Maas would win because she tends to always win if she has a release on there. Although Brandon Sanderson and R.F. Kuang and then Stephen King could all give them a run for their money. So I actually don't know which one's going to win. But regardless, as far as nominees go, I'm currently leaning in I don't love that something that didn't come out this year can still qualify this year if it was put out by a traditional publisher. But I haven't thought that extensively about it. That's just kind of first impressions. So if you have your own view on this, maybe you have reasons why you do think that it should count, feel free. I'm not married to the idea that it's a bad thing or anything like that. Also, nothing new. This has been brought up a number of times by a number of people. I think that the fantasy romance category should exist. I think that something like the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, the Sarah J. Maas books, the Jennifer L. Armentrout books, they are just, I don't want to limit, and I don't want us to have all these subgenres, or what I was starting to say is I don't want to limit what is considered fantasy, but at this point, fantasy romance is so huge and has such a large readership that it just feels so separate from some of the other fantasy things out there. And I think it would be really cool to have a fantasy romance category, because then it would allow people who like fantasy romance to get to discover more within the Goodreads nominees. Whenever they're announced, they might be like, oh, I like those, and now here's some other suggestions, so I'm going to try these ones out. They might discover them. And then same with fantasy. If you find you typically like less of the fantasy romance and more just fantasy, then maybe you could come to the Goodreads nominees and discover some other books that you hadn't heard about previously. So I'm all for there being a fantasy romance category. I understand that at some point we could break every genre up into subgenres, but fantasy romance at this point just, it feels big enough. And you also already see that young adult and young adult fantasy has been broken apart. So there are times where it's broken up. Anyway, the broken record, lots of people have said that before, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree with that point. The last thing I wanted to mention in the discussion portion is just that I think it's a little odd to let books that literally came out on the cutoff date, I think it's strange to allow those books to be on the Goodreads nominees. So specifically, I'm referring to The Lost Metal. It came out on November 15th, which was the cutoff date for the Goodreads nominees. And I think that's strange because that means very few people have had the opportunity to read that book by the time the Goodreads nominees have come out. And there's a chance that people have time to read it before voting, but it sort of encourages, I think, people to just vote for it because they like Sanderson or because they like that series. Also, I just want to say, I didn't think that Book of Night by Holly Black was going to be on there because even though Holly Black is a big name, I was like, I don't think that's going to happen because a lot of people haven't loved that book, even though it's been popular, and it looks like it wasn't on the list. So I'm curious, for those of you who thought about that book and were wondering, are you surprised that it wasn't there? Or are you not surprised at all? I know I said a moment ago that that would be my last talking point, but I actually have one more thing I want to say, kind of two things I want to say. So I've mentioned this in the past, but I still think that there are two ways that would significantly improve the Goodreads nominees. And one would be to have sequels have their own category. I think that oftentimes when sequels show up, they're usually from big name authors like the Sarah J. Maas's, like the Brandon Sandersons, and those authors are already going to have such a huge advantage over debut authors or people that are maybe not as well known. And then the other thing that kind of goes hand in hand with that is I think it would be really interesting if the nominees had some kind of breakdown where you were voting on a certain amount based off of how many reviews or how many ratings, that would probably be a better way to do it, how many ratings exist. So to elaborate and make it a little clearer, it would be cool if there was a category of books that have somewhere between 500 to 10,000 ratings, and then you had 10,000 to 20,000, and then after that you had 20,000 plus, or something like that. I'm just throwing numbers out there. Those probably aren't even good ranges, but you get the idea where that way people who have put out books that a lot of people have really enjoyed, a lot of people really value, if those books actually had a chance, because they don't right now. Because even if the smallest percentage of people who have actually read the Sarah J. Maas book, even if a tiny percentage of those people vote for Sarah J. Maas's book, that tiny percentage is still more than all of the people for some of these smaller names. And so they just don't have a chance. And I don't want to say, oh, who cares? Nobody takes the Goodreads nominees seriously. I don't want to say that because, one, it's not true. A lot of people have a lot of fun with these. But on top of that, there are a lot of authors where it means a lot to them to see their book on the Goodreads nominees. And I don't want to take away from that excitement and that accomplishment for them because it is really exciting. And I've already seen authors whose books I've read and I follow on Instagram, they're posting about how exciting it is to see their books show up on the list. So I don't want to take it away from them and be really negative and be like, who cares? This list is dumb or something like that. I do just think that there are ways the nominees could be better, and I would like to see some of those things implemented in future years. Getting now into a couple of the other books within other categories, as well as some books that I'm interested in reading now that the Goodreads nominees has been released. So I have some notes written in front of me. I'm going to refer to them. The Sunbearer Trials, which is in the young adult category, I am interested in that. I'm interested in If You Could See the Sun. It was one of my anticipated releases. It's one I've been really wanting to get around to, just haven't had the chance yet. And there's a few others within the young adult category as well that I'm interested in. Within the debut novel category, The Maid is one that sounded like something I might enjoy. It's not fantasy at all. It's a murder mystery, but it's a cozy murder mystery. Within the sci-fi category, I've never read a Blake Crouch book, but I knew that Blake Crouch was going to show up, and it did. I happen to have, I think, a couple of Blake Crouch books. One that was a book of the month selection for sure, and that is the one that showed up. So Upgrade, I think is what it's called. I might check that one out. We also have Genesis of Misery that sounded really interesting, and Ocean's Echo. I was wanting to check that one out at some point. Now coming back to the adult fantasy picks that I haven't read. Thistlefoot, I like the idea of a Baba Yaga type of retelling. This one, though, it just something about the way it was described, I wasn't sure if it would be to my taste, but I will probably check it out at some point, especially now that it's popped up here. I know a lot of people have loved Legends and Lattes. The couple times I've made videos about cozy fantasy or just cozy books, everybody's always like, what about Legends and Lattes? And I'm like, yeah, I know, I haven't read it yet. So that I'm annoyed at you all. I just mean, I'm like always aware, and I'm like, somebody's gonna bring it up, and I just haven't had the chance to read that one just yet. A River Enchanted, I think another mythology retelling or folktale retelling of some sort, but I have that one, so I might check that out. And then some of the other ones, if they're sequels, I'm not going to get around to them. So likely the Naomi Novik book is a third in the series. I don't really see myself picking that up before the end of the year. I don't know if I'm interested in picking up Fairy Tale by Stephen King. And then a couple of the other ones, The Book Eaters, When Women Were Dragons, they don't really sound like my cup of tea, but you never know. I wrote them down. Maybe at some point I'll see them at my local used bookstore or at the library, and maybe I'll give them a go. But there's certain ones that I think I'm leaning more toward. Definitely let me know if there's any that you really want me to get around to, and I'll try to prioritize those. But anyway, that's it for the Goodreads nominees, kind of more leaning into the fantasy nominees specifically. I will do a couple of videos more than likely following up on if I do get around to some of these. They will take the place of my new fantasy releases videos that I have been doing. So I might do one or two Goodreads wrap-ups, but no guarantees because kind of the end of the year, I'm sort of wrapping everything up for the year, and I don't know how much time I'll be able to dedicate to some of these. But regardless, if you have some that you'd like me to check out, let me know. Let me know your thoughts on these nominees in general. Are there some surprises on there? Are there some that you're thinking aren't surprising at all? What are some that you feel like definitely should have been on there and you're upset that they weren't? But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.